Listen and learn before you speak or lead. That's Oscar Munoz's motto. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. On this show, we share perspectives from leading corporate directors and discuss what makes boards effective, how they can help companies face challenges today, and become future ready. In this episode, host Susan Paley, NACD Vice President of the Chapter Network, interviews Oscar Munoz, former chair and CEO of United Airlines and author of the best-selling book Turnaround Time, Uniting an Airline and its Employees in the Friendly Skies. Together, they'll break down his early influences, how he adjusted his leadership style as he moved through the C-suite and into the boardroom, and talk about the importance of empathy and authenticity. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Oscar Munoz, thank you for investing your time and energy in being with us for this conversation today. What does fostering authenticity mean to you? And in your view, what role does the board play in that?
Well, authenticity and credibility, I think, go hand in hand. One sort of fosters the other. And with your question about the board's role in that, within the board, fellow directors can tell if one of their board colleagues are, not sufficiently engaged, educated on the topic, and effective in their communications. It can lead to some breakdowns in the dynamics of how a board works, and something we recognize in the Blue Ribbon High Performance Board details that we wrote last summer. But beyond the board, in the eyes of sort of the wider company that you represent if you're on the board, the public perception of that company rests upon the authenticity. That starts to some degree with the CEO, certainly, but the board as well. And honestly, we see it all the time, and we're seeing it play out in the aerospace world with Boeing, where, it's like, does the organization get it? Does the board get it? Are they out of touch? And we see examples of that all the time. So authenticity and again, credibility, trust, if you will, all go hand in hand. And a lot of it is just by everybody being aligned and agreeing and communicating in a way that actually appears genuine to the broader public, because we live in a world where it's no longer one way. It's two way, and people opine, and social media is what it is, good and bad, but it is so critically important for all of us to understand that humans in general, it's like you described, what does it mean to you? Well, it means that someone trusts what you said, plain and simple.
So you talked a little bit about trust and being genuine, and you talked about credibility. And some of our listeners will have dived into your book already, Turnaround Time. And I know that you seem to have a great deal of investment in that idea of trust and credibility. So I'm wondering if we can pause on that to talk about your executive and board career in a moment, but take us back in time, if you would, to your early life. How do you think you arrived at who you are today? How did your early days influence your career and indeed your leadership style?
Oh, there's an old saying, in Tennyson's poem on Ulysses, there's a great line that says, "I am parts of all that I've met." And your question with regards to my early life and all of our early lives, we've all been shaped. By the time we get to the point where we're doing things in this world, whatever endeavor we choose, it's all been sort of nurtured by the people that have raised us. And so for me, my early life, as I detail in the book, and frankly, it's things I did not and have not shared all of my life until you write the book, was that I was an immigrant. I was born outside of this country. that I came to this country without documents for a period of time, as my mom left me as a young baby. My single mom left me and left me with my maternal grandmother, which I spent 8 years of my life in the northern part of Mexico. Going from family member to friend. We didn't have our own home, but in the Hispanic world, familia, family means a lot. It has a lot more depth. And so we were never without a home because we always had somebody open their door to us. That was my early life, and the latent or dormant values that I've realized that came from, at the time, my maternal grandmother, who was an incredibly hardworking, turn the other cheek, never complain, never blame anyone. All those wonderful qualities that we love in others, and we love to think that we have them all ourselves. This is a person in my life, one of the only humans that I've ever seen actually live all of that. And she was a peasant woman, as best description. She did not have any type of education. But when it came to this concept of, treating someone else as another human without any agenda whatsoever, she was that person. And that has, throughout my course of my life, my career, my relationships, both personal and professional, that while I have forgotten it at times, as we all tend to do as humans, in the toughest, and I mean toughest times of my life and career, when I've had a real crisis on my hand, it is those latent and dormant values of her complete humanity that really shone to the surface, that allowed me to listen to others, to understand, to be empathetic, to understand that trust travels at the speed of transparency, indeed, and how you have to give of yourself to get others to trust you. And everything that I've done in my career, in some way or shape, started with that concept. And we can go into any of those details at any point in time. But I've learned to, as I think of the past and all the information and reviews and feedback that I've gotten from all my various companies and supervisors, there was always that concept of work ethic. Guess where I got that from? My maternal grandmother. The ability to work with anyone at any time, at any place, and understanding them. Again, this was a woman that did that constantly. And more mine, but, she never promised anything she couldn't deliver. And that's led to my premise of proof, not just promise. And so all that early life aspect is an integral, if not key, component of who I am as a person, but increasingly as also a business leader.
So if Tennyson instructed us that we are parts of all that we have met, it sounds like your grandmother, that part was outsized in the best possible way.
Oh, my goodness. And it's funny because, all of us will reflect on it in times of stress. Where do we get our ability to make a decision? There's a fork in the road. Which one do you left? And those forks are often difficult to maneuver. And I've had several of those in my career where I just, it's just as trite as what would my grandmother do kind of thing. But those things come up inside you and say, this is a time where I just got to stand up and own this issue and deal with it as transparently and genuinely and truthfully as possible. Yeah, that's come back more than a few times.
You mentioned a phrase that stuck with me, proof, not promise. And it strikes me as something that can really go through our career as our partner alongside. We're attached at the hip with what our, as my friend likes to call it, our say-do ratio is. And it invites me to cast your mind back to your executive career and wondering how that played, especially when you began to interact with the board of directors. Can you recall the first time you interacted with a board and what that experience was like, how you decided to approach that, given what you just described you have come from?
Well, I have a funny, a quick funny one, then I'll be more contemporary. But the first time I ever spoke in front of the board, it was at the Coca-Cola Company. And these are the types like Warren Buffett. I mean, just back in the day, this was a board of blue chip humans that no one ever knew. And so it was a big thing because I was a young kid. And we were introducing the concept of water as a beverage, which now is everywhere, right? And everyone knows it. But there was a time when, a soft drink company sold soft drinks. And I did a lot of the research and the work and introduced that and got to go to the board meeting to sort of pitch it. And of course, talking about the concept of taking water and putting in a package and selling it for more than our flagship Coke product was the exact question that one Warren Buffett asked me as I finished my presentation. So that was my first, but my first real experience as a board member when I was, selected to join a board, and my first meeting was probably a very watershed moment, because again, I'd been in boards, been around boards, but when you become part of one, it's a different. Now you're a participant and people are asking you. And so I've always, another phrase that I use is listen and learn before you speak or lead. And I think for me, walking into what was then the Continental Airlines board, I was a very young person that had just stepped into my first C-suite role, and now also my first board role. So, I was coming of age in that regard, but I knew enough. And again, back to my formative years and my grandmother of humility and all that. It was just important that I made sure that I was that the value of listening to everyone. There was just a word that and a concept that was very important to me. So for all of the aspiring board members and directors that want to be that, and again, how you walk into that board and that first impression you make is a really important one. You're clearly gifted and knowledgeable, and people are excited to have you. But now you have to be part of the team. And how do you sort of engage and involve yourself and integrate yourself into the fiber of that culture is a really important thing that both boards as a general rule can help newcomers come in, but newcomers also need to understand that, I call it a concept, you can't come in all asses and elbows. Like, hey, I'm so great. I was just a CEO. I know everything. And you take over the boardroom with your stories and conjectures and past experiences. That's not often helpful because, the board that you're on has specific issues and already a slotted process of how decisions get made. Figure out how that is and then involve yourself in that right way. And you'll find the team writ large, both management and the board, really, really embracing you and listening to your input because they know it comes from a good place.
I hear through your words and your mantra there that the old saying, seek first to understand, comes to mind about how you might handle yourself in those situations.
Yeah, that is an old phrase that I've used. It's advice you give to anyone at any level, right. Especially when you're moving up in your career, when you step into a new role, seek first to understand, and then, and only then, to be understood. Because again, this human dynamic of you're new, people are expecting change, and if you're the change, you can really, really get a level of engagement and capture hearts and minds indeed if you allow people to answer the question of why they do the things that they do. Because there's always a good reason why they do them. It may not be the way you choose to do or the way you want to do them long term, but it would behoove you so greatly if you just stopped for a second and said, gosh, why is it that we do that? And then listen intently to that. You actually may learn something that you didn't know before you jumped into it. That person will be so much more engaged that you asked them, because if you do want to change it, you can come back real quickly and say, thank you, Bill or Jamie, for letting me know about that. And say, I was wondering, or I was thinking maybe we could do this. And it just makes for, again, in the world of leadership, gaining traction and commitment to change is so fundamental. And sometimes we as leaders think that just because we the boss, we can make things happen, and it don't work that way anymore.
Something tells me that this listening bit is going to be it's foreshadowing for our conversation shortly about the turnaround at United. But before we get to that, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about how you found yourself in your first board seat, but I can't help but wonder, you described your first interaction with a board, standing up at the Coca-Cola board meeting and having a question from Warren Buffett. How over the years since that moment has your view of the boardroom changed over time?
Boards have changed dramatically. Back in the day, there were a lot of intertwined boards where if you and I ran companies, we sat on each other's boards, specifically each other's comp committee. It was a bit of it wasn't as thorough and as detailed. There wasn't a lot of direction. We didn't have a lot of the, sort of hedge fund and activism that you have today, where people, rather than selling their stock, they come in and want to make change. So I think the level of engagement from boards have changed dramatically. Importantly, and this is evolving, But I see it, and all the boards I sit on, I really try to engage management and CEOs in a way that, as an executive, it's always seemed like it was our job as management to sort of manage the board. It's like, oh gosh, we got to talk about our budget or our comp plan or a big strategic initiative, and we know Oscar's going to think this way, and Susan's going to think that way, and everybody's that is so hard to do and try to gauge everybody's input and then build that into a presentation. I think as time has gone on and evolved, it is so much easier to engage the board throughout, not just at board meetings, but if socialize issues. Is like I would call you, and if I'm the CEO, or if you're the CEO, you would call me and say, hey, Oscar, I'm thinking about this initiative. Here's how I'm thinking about it. I know you have experience in this. What are your thoughts on this? And it feels like a lot more work, and it is, but you actually begin to tap into the very experience and acumen and knowledge and brilliance and wisdom of the people you've decided to put on your board, which is what the board is there for. But for a while there, it just became, well, a board is an obstacle into the things that we want to do, and we have to, quote, convince them. There's an easier way of involving, engaging. Again, you mentioned earlier, listening to what they have. Use them for what they're worth. And they're all valued for different things. And creating your board structure and your board composition is another evolving thing where rather than saying we need another person that has this type of background and experience based on the current board and its composition and the things we as a company need to go forward strategically. Gosh, we need somebody with more global experience or more financial acumen, or whether it's cyber or supply, all the different things. I just think all of these things become part and parcel. But the evolution is gaining traction in that you use the board for its abilities as a partner rather than as having someone to manage. But the real evolution has become that boards indeed have a lot more pressure to be more interactive, more knowledgeable, more inquisitive, and raise opposition and raise concerns. And so it's even more imperative that you work together rather than apart.
I hear the threads of partnership in your perspective in terms of what it's evolved to. You also mentioned specific needs around the boardroom table when you spoke about composition, cyber, and other specific, really what the day is calling for now. While that has evolved entirely over the past few decades and very recent years, what was your path to your first board seat?
Relating back to the last question with regards to, and I mentioned cyber and other things, I think boards and CEOs are, while they're evolving in certain industries to have experts in some of those fields, cyber being probably one of them, not all boards need that. But again, if you do a true assessment of what you really need most, oftentimes you need someone with multiple skill sets, and somebody in cyber may be an incredible and best cyber person in the world, but the company needs somebody that's got more operational background or interaction in dealing with government or unions or all sorts of things. People that are narrower, if you will, with regards to their chosen skill set. And cyber is a very complicated process. Usually don't have those other things. So for all the people that are listening that feel they have a real strong expertise in one thing and that should be valuable to a board, it probably is. It's going to be a limited number of boards necessarily. And then to your question of how I found myself first on the board, there's a lot of people that are sort of lobbying, running for office, using search firms to get themselves. It's difficult. And I don't, the numbers I may get right or close, there's only around 5,000-ish board seats in U.S. public companies. And I think last I checked, there was only like 300 to 350 board seats that actually become available open at any given time. So it's not a big window, and a lot of people need to go through all these measures to try to get on boards, and they feel they're being rejected for different reasons, and their background, their heritage, their orientation, all of those things, and all of that still plays out. The biggest fact of the matter is that there's just not a lot of them. So just keep and be mindful of that. And a CEO and a board will want the best available candidate to fit a lot of roles. Sometimes it's specific to things like cyber, as an example that we're using, but not always. And to that end, how I first got on my board, I had just joined as CFO of a public company way back in the day. And one of my bankers that I was just being introduced to as we were trying to turn that company around, we got to know each other and work each other for a couple of months. Well, that investment banker person covered transportation writ large. So he also had obviously an association and a partnership with, at the time, Continental Airlines, being in the transportation space. And just a happenstance conversation, right? Continental saying, hey, the guy named Nelson Walsh, it's like, we're looking for a board. We're looking for a financial expert that has some background in transportation. Nelson says, hey, I got a guy that just joined CSX and happens to be a financial expert as a CFO and is learning transportation. And it's like, oh, great, set it up. And so, we went and I met and we said hello, and that followed up with a couple of more conversations, more in depth. And that's how, in essence, easily it happened for me. That's not how it happens for everyone else. But my advice here is simple. Develop whatever expertise you have as best as you can, and then let other people recognize that. And somewhere in the networking process, you will be found. The search process is intensive, but again, just be aware that the numbers just aren't in everyone's favor to get things that quickly. That thing being board seats.
Yeah, indeed. Our listeners and members of NACD probably are getting used to this commentary. You just told a real life story, which goes back to the heart of relationship being the source of how you ended up in that board seat.
Yeah, it really is.
So when we hear you talk, Oscar, we hear the threads of various elements of your career winding through your wisdom. We hear you in the C-suite. We hear you starting out. We hear you in the boardroom. So I'd be curious, how have you tweaked your leadership style over your career? You've gone from being in the C-suite to serving on your board, from being a director on a board to being a CEO while staying on that board at that same company. Then you became the chair of United as the former CEO. How can you speak to what you felt as your evolving leadership style there?
I laugh at that because it feels like a lot of times when people go through your bios, he had jobs here and in this industry and that industry. And I always comment, it's like, it just kind of shows that I really can't hold the job because there's been so many transitions. That's a great question. Actually, I've never been asked that before. So thank you. I think, your leadership style and who you are never really quite changes. You adapt your style and how you approach things, certainly. Because that's part of being a good leader, is understanding the environment. This whole concept of listen and learn before you lead. So from being in the C-suite to first serving on the first board, I think probably I knew how it felt to go in front of my own board and some of the difficulties that you face, and some of the opposition and some of the inquisition that came. So I think as a board member, I wanted to be that board member that was seen as helpful and as thoughtful and as someone that you could approach privately or in the boardroom to actually assist rather than play the gotcha game. It's like, at Coke, and at Pepsi, we had this thing called Stump the Stars, where senior management was just like part of especially at Pepsi, it was a part where you got in front of people and everything was focused on making you wilt under pressure. And they called it Stump the Stars. I developed a method where I would write my notes down and my questions. And if the CFO I would write 2 or 3 notes and hand them to her at the break, rather than, confront these issues in front of everyone or, these long-winded questions. Well, back at my company, what I do is this. I would just write this like, hey, that seemed incongruent with this, or that seemed aligned. And so it was more trying to be helpful so that they would reach out to you and actually ask you your input. So that's going on that first board. Being a director and then becoming the CEO, that was a little dicey. And it was a long, and again, not to plug the book, but there's a very long set of chapters or pages on that concept and how that process went. I was very much, I was already on my own board at CSX and about to become CEO of that company. So that was a transition that was about to happen. And then to go from a board member to a CEO was really unique. But I think at the end of the day, the real conversation, my first meeting, I realized very quickly when I went through my sort of, here's what I have found since we last spoke. Thank you for having me as your CEO. And these are my peers for 5 years that we've worked as peers. Now I'm their CEO. And the relationship changed. And I noticed that after the first meeting, because I approached my conversation in a very sort of informal way. Hey, Bill, hey, Mary, well, you know this, you know this. It was just very conversational. But the standard was clearly raised. They were looking for more clarity, more specificity, more longer term view strategically. Hey, we've made this big decision and you now need to step up to it. And so I realized I had to sort of back down a little bit and realize that there was that friendship sort of peer relationship had changed dramatically. And now I, in essence, worked for them. And I had to make that conversation just a bit more serious. And that was a big transition and kind of a little bit of a shocker because, they're my friends. It's like, yes, but they now have the power to keep you or not keep you in that regard. The last one, becoming a chair, I selected my successor. During my time frame, the process was built in. We knew it was going to happen. It was always sort of thought we would execute the backdrop at United was we had 8 CEOs in the previous 10 years before me. And one of my first conversations with my new board, it's like, hey, whatever else we do, we ain't doing this again. We are going to have enough time and a person in a high position here where the transition from myself to that person, whenever that happens, is not going to be this shocking, glaring sort of, Pluto to Mars kind of change in pace. It is going to be generally consistent and congruent. Of course, there will be some differences. And so that was, so it was easy from that regard. We made the announcement. Frankly, COVID hit, which was real significant. And there was conversation about, well, gee, do we make the change at this point in time? But again, this is one of the leadership conversations that I always just dramatically and emphatically say, this is the hardest thing about leadership is that it is never, and I mean never, about you as the person. It is about the people you lead and the people you serve. And giving up a role before you're ready, or giving up a role when the time is right, or understanding that the new person coming into the role is going to need time to develop their own process. During COVID, the decisions we were making for the longer term company were such that I would not have to deal with them. As an example, how much debt we took on, what the levels and what, right? That is something that the person that's going to have the reins is better served in making it because he would have to deal with it for many years afterwards, rather than me who could easily say, oh yeah, let's take more money or let's take less. And so it's those decisions and that concept of that leadership is not about you, but the people you serve is a really important part. And the concept of succession, and I've talked about this incessantly, it is the hardest thing to do as a senior leader, especially the senior most leader, because it in fact implies that you are starting the clock on your tenure. Again, it's not an easy thing, and I wish I could tell you I embraced it wholly, but that's not always the case. But it is something that's important for the good of the enterprise, because then the transition happens. And again, in our experience at United with 8 CEOs in 10 years, what the ramifications of that were clearly that we had lost the trust of our employees completely, because they just didn't know which way to turn. I mean, 8 different people, we're going to do this. And then somebody comes in, we're going to do that. And so these are all very practical thoughts that I hope make a little sense to our listeners. But this concept of leadership, I tell you, the hardest thing about it is knowing when to sort of cede it to someone else when the time is right.
Yeah, there's so much profound wisdom in what you just talked about. But one of the things that comes through for me is the weightiness of what you had on your shoulders in different ways at different times.
Yeah. That's that agility and flexibility comes out of many years of failure and doing it the wrong way, by the way. And I think that's a chapter in life for all of us that we, reach this phase of our sort of career. The more you can espouse and communicate, frankly, my book is a lot about those failures rather than, hey, look at us and all the great things we did. Helping people avoid those pitfalls is just for me, a real marching point in a lot of the things that I do.
Well, Oscar, speaking of failure, what was your approach throughout your career, and has it changed now in terms of failure? Do you run toward it knowing there are lessons to be learned? Do you cringe still because you said there are pitfalls to avoid? How do you think it through, and what do you notice?
Hey, stuff happens, and it's going to happen to you, and you're going to face these crucial, monumental decisions. So I do a lot of bike riding, and when you bike and with a lot of people, there's a concept that we talk about sort of privately. It's like it is not if you're going to fall at some point in time; it is when you're going to fall. And so you prepare for the inevitable in a way. And I think understanding the difference between what crisis is and what an emergency is, and how you react to each, is a really important thing. I talk a lot about it in my social media channels about what the important is, but a lot of it is just preparation. You cannot even begin to anticipate the stuff that's going to happen to you. But when it does, how are you going to react? Who's going to be a decision maker? Who are your constituents? How many people are you going to involve? How quickly you're going to respond? You're going to probably respond badly initially. How do you recover from that? And so, rather than there's no methodology, there's no template other than understanding that it is going to happen, and it's always going to happen when you least expect it. And again, I have several of these conversations that I've had, most notably the dragging of that customer that everyone knows about, and how I badly reacted to it initially, and then how quickly we pivoted from that to be something that was much more positive. And so it's just going to happen. And just know, and that preparation, that awareness, people you're going to reach out to, there's a host of different things, but mostly it's going to happen. It's going to happen to you. A lot of people are going through it right now.
The inevitability of it is something to bear in mind. And I feel like we could invite you back for a whole separate podcast about failure and how to recover from it. Maybe we'll think about that. But you mentioned the word pivot, and it made me think it was a good segue to ask you pointedly about how you developed your turnaround plan for United. Where did you even begin?
Well, again, back to these latent dormant values. When asked, so my being called up to be the CEO of United at, again, a crisis moment for the company with, just everything was broken in every way, shape, or form. The announcement of me coming from the board to be CEO was not met well by a lot of the industry analysts and followers, because what the hell does this guy know about an airline? And because of my very transparent self, when asked any question, I'm very honest. It's like, listen, that's a great question. I don't know yet, but let me go figure that out. And nowhere was that more prominent than in our first earnings call when I got asked that same question. Oh, yeah, well, you're here and you don't know anything about this. And, they're very coy how they ask these very pointed questions. But basically, hey, you don't know Jack, and now you got to run this. And do you even have a plan of what you're going to do? And of course, my answer was, it's a great question. And I don't know yet. But I'll tell you what I am going to do. I'm going to go listen and learn, I didn't use those terms, to the people that probably have the best foundational and perceptive knowledge of what is ailing our company today. Because we're a customer service, customer-centric business that's highly operational, highly logistical, highly engaged, and never, ever stopping, right? It's just, we have hundreds of planes in the air at any point in time in any given day. And so what is wrong out there? Well, I clearly had lots of folks telling me from the financial community, from all our consultants, my board, certainly my customers were more than excited to tell me all the things that weren't working. And my answer in that call was, again, on the spot and back to my dormant values. It's like, you know what? I don't know yet, but I'm going to take the next 60 to 90 days. I was going to say 30 to 60, but I changed it the last minute because I realized, oh, shoot, I may not learn everything I need to do. Because this again, another leadership concept that I speak about. A turnaround, in a case of a turnaround, there's many things that are broken that need to be fixed. How you go about finding the one thing you're going to start with that's going to be the base for all the changes you're going to make on forward is, I think, a really critical part. So how do you get to that one thing you're going to start with? Well, you got to go listen to someone. You can listen to your constituents in the financial marketplace, your board, your customers for sure. But for me, with 100,000 strong, operating at then 80 different countries, I really thought that the best way to get a sense and understanding of them was to go out and talk to those folks, which is not easy because it's a distributed workforce, meaning we don't have factory floors in an airline. Everybody's onesies, twosies. And so I went on this listening tour, and that was the approach of how to get to that point. It's like, what am I going to find out from them? Again, part of a longer story, but the punchline and all that, it sounds really great. People say, well, how could you possibly have spoken to 100,000 people? Well, here's the value of being genuine, being transparent, and actually really, truly listening to someone. You can't just dial it in. You can't just be walking around rooms and have people take pictures and notes for you and think you're listening. This required me to stand in front of wherever I found them, all hours of the day and night, literally, and just asking them, how you doing? And then once you kind of gain their trust for some way of just, having a human conversation, they would begin to tell you, here's what I think, here's what I think. And it's like, well, doesn't that take a long time? Yeah, to reach 100,000 people, of course. But the magic of human interaction and true listening and this genuine empathy, for lack of a better term, is that what does that person do after that conversation? Well, they go home, they go to their next meeting, they go to their, all of a sudden inside the company, it's like, hey, there's this guy walking around. He actually talked to me. He sat down for however many times. We talked about family. We talked about football, whatever it might be. But we began to slowly regain the trust of those employees, and I began to hear a lot. Now, here's the second downside of all that listening. I had no shortage of advice from people as to what needed to be fixed first or at all. Well, now you go talk to thousands of people in your organization. Guess what you have more of? Oh, lots of input from lots of different people on everything you can. And that's the other pushback I get on this concept of listen and learn. It's like, well, Oscar, by listening to all these people, aren't you establishing the expectation that indeed you're going to do everything they've told you? And that's another part of developing having a trustful conversation with someone. I can say, if I asked you a question and you told me, oh my gosh, this, and this, at the end of the day, I would say, hey, thank you very much. Understand that I am listening to anyone and everyone, and it's all going to be part of a bigger parcel that I don't know what it looks like yet. And I hopefully when you hear it, part of what we've just discussed is part of it, but just know that don't have that I would just be very frank and honest in that regard. And so that listening tour led to lots of information. Unfortunately, it was voluminous, to say the least. And, heading back to Chicago from part of this trip to have all these big, huge meetings that I was going to have with all sorts of folks about everybody expecting that I'd come back with the answer. And I did not have the answer. And on that flight, fortuitously, if nothing else, I asked a question of one of our flight attendants who didn't really want to talk because, again, she had been, she was the perfect example of what happens when you have 8 CEOs in 10 years. She's like, I ain't talking to you. I'm talking to anybody because none of you have done anything. You've promised everything. You haven't done. My life hasn't changed. And, you all suck, for lack of a better term. She didn't say any of those words, but the way she looked at me and crossed her arms said, okay, well, I'm just going to go back and sit down in my seat and thank you for listening. But she stopped me and grabbed me. She goes, well, listen, I heard you've been talking to folks. And she said, and very emotionally with tears, and it took a lot for her to get it out. She said the words that are a watershed moment for United Airlines' turnaround. She said, Oscar, I'm just tired of always having to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that your flight's not on time because she has nothing to do with the flights are on time. I'm sorry you don't like your coffee. She had nothing to do. Everything she apologized was for the greater. In essence, apologizing for me and people like me for decisions that people like me made, and she just had to implement. But again, she's the front face of, you travel, obviously. I mean, that's who you in essence, complain to. And for me, that crystallized everything I was hearing. It's like, oh my gosh, we have put everything on these employees and given them so much different direction that they've lost complete trust in who we are as leaders. And so no matter what I say, I'm going to have to regain their trust before anything else. And that was the basis for everything we were able to do in the coming months in the initial turnaround. And that, by the way, was the phrase I used when asked again, what are you going to do, big guy, now that you're back from all this listening and other things? And I said, you know what, we're going to regain the trust of and I paused, of our employees. And of course, our customers revolted, our financial community revolted. It's like, hey, shouldn't we be getting everything? But over time, we were able to explain and prove, importantly, maybe get proof, not promise, that indeed, without recapturing the trust of those 100,000 people that take care of you and all the things that are in the aircraft, in the airports, without that, we would have never gotten anywhere. So it was a bold move. And by the time, it wasn't well received. It wasn't well received when I said, I got to go find out. Our stock dropped. And then when I said, we're going to regain the trust, that's your big thing, stock dropped again, because that implied, oh my God, he's going to go give them everything. And we had a big union issues going on. So that was a part of it. So that was, again, a long-winded sort of answer to the question, but not meaning to be long-winded. But, these kind of questions and this kind of leadership decisions that we as humans and everyone that's listening as leaders learn, that it provides context to how you have to think about things, how it fits your personality, and how you go after this. You're hearing who I am in this process. And, most of the time, it's hard to not want to listen and learn from someone that is showing you the same respect. And in doing so, we turned around a very big global company that was truly broken.
In that storytelling, Oscar, we hear the hallmarks of what we've been discussing around authenticity, trust, listening, first and foremost, which we know are elements of culture. And so we've been talking about culture as an organization with you as the CEO. Allow me to shift just a little bit in the lens we're using with this culture conversation. You were co-chair of the 2023 NACD Blue Ribbon Commission on Culture as the foundation, and it was around building a high-performance board. Why, in your view, is board culture so important in today's environment?
Well, I think the context for that report and the incredible array of really wise and experienced board members that were part of the broader committee besides the two co-chairs. We debated and discussed something very unique and led by me and others with a lot of those missives are, again, outwardly geared. Hey, we as the NACD, Blue Ribbon Committee, think you all should think and do these sorts of things. And then often that direction is focused on how you as a board member can direct your management teams in your company. So it's, you all should do this. And if you just did that, and if you did it this way, you would all be better off. It was an interesting turn of events as we kind of turned that inward. It's like, hey, and again, this is back to my premise at United, where rather than, saying, okay, you employees, you need to do that, the premise there was we as management needed to regain their trust. And meaning that it's like, so they would ask, what do we have to do as employees? It's like, that's the beauty of this thing. You don't have to do anything. We have to do everything in order to regain your trust. This Blue Ribbon chair had a lot of the same views in my part, where it's like, hey, we don't look at ourselves as an entity unto ourselves. And so this report does something I think unique. It recommends that when boards set out to elevate their corporate culture or guide and direct their corporate, they should begin by first looking inward and all the internal culture and dynamics of the board itself. And we have this wheel, and we talk about sort of elephants in the room. What do you do when a director's not performing? What do you do when a board, director has to lead or not acting properly? How do you manage those own things? Because at the end of the day, as a CEO who had a board, it was always wise and it was always great to know that they were generally aligned on things. Here's what we need, rather than 14 in my disparate voices. Because it's hard to react to that many viewpoints and that bit of guidance. And so this document and the choice of the thematic and topic and the direction we give is one that we should look inward. And how do you? I talked a little about it earlier. If you have new income, how do you choose boards? How do you choose board members based on what skills they bring, and how do you integrate them and onboard them onto a board and its culture? So simple things like a board buddy is one simple example where, if I was joining your board, you would assign me someone that says, hey, Oscar, just, feel free to call on me, but here's how this board works. Here's who does what and when. So you have some sense of it, which again makes my onboarding a little bit simpler. So it was, I thought it was a unique that reports like that don't normally do, is to look inward to fix our own issues first.
Another matter that's close to the heart of NACD and to boards is this current world that we're in is a polarized environment more than ever. And following the Supreme Court ruling last year about affirmative action, talk to us for a moment about why diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging really matter, and how the board or the CEO both of them lead on this matter.
Oh my gosh. This is, again, DEI, ESG have all become these foul 4-letter words because of the divide that we have in our country. So that's a broader conversation, and I have many things to say about that, but that borders on politics, which this should not be. This concept of diversity and inclusion, meaning different viewpoints, should be included, involved, engaged. It goes back to my pure philosophical heart on listening, right? Listening means you listen to anyone and everyone that has something to say, regardless of where they come from. In my world, our turnaround was listening to the people at the front line, which again is a bit of diversity and inclusion, because those are people like, what are they going to know, says Wall Street? Well, it turned out they knew quite a bit. So I think of this, and I advise people, it's like, put aside the political sort of remnants for as much as you can. This is just practical stuff. It's about competition, not conscientiousness. I mean, the verdict is in, and all the studies that everyone has done, diversity of thought, as well as all the other forms of diversity, it does matter. And it's just not about race or color or gender. Your boards are diversifying. We talked a little bit about, recruiting directors with specialized skills if needed in their particular industry. We talked about cyber, but digital, human capital, marketing, all the things on that. Women have made great inroads into boards filled, because you remember a time when there was very few. Color and race appeared to be, although there's still a lot of progress to make. I know Black America has made big moves in that. Hispanic America, which I belong to, still has a very low percentage. So, with that regard, but it also goes to sort of just age. I mean, I joined a board when I was in I think I was 41, which was very, very young at the time for joining that. But with today's evolving world, especially whether you mention cyber or the digital space, there are so many of your customers are that Gen Z, millennial, all those phrases we use. And so, finding, board members that are, for lack of a better term, younger, that are more in touch with that can really, really affect how a board thinks. So again, in all of this stuff, I haven't mentioned, you just need to have race and color. It's so much broader than that. And I think, you leave talent on the sidelines when you do that. And I was always happy to scoop all of that up where I can. And again, and then probably the last thing with regards to the concept of diversity and inclusion is meritocracy has to rule. If you indeed put people in roles because you're trying to manage the optics of your organization to show that you have X percent of certain sort of race or color in your thing, and you put people in places that they're not quite ready for, it's just going to fail. You actually do a disservice to someone, because it's just like you put somebody in place, they happen to be of color, and somebody says, well, and it doesn't work out, not because they're bad or incapable people. They just weren't ready for that role potentially. But then that gets interpreted as that those kind of people aren't ready for those roles. I mean, we had issue in NFL, in football. I mean, we didn't have a black quarterback in the league for so long because it was kind of ordained that, well, that's a, whatever kind of job. Well, now it's completely different. So I just think you're leaving talent on the sidelines and other people will scoop it up. But it's all about competition and not about optics and conscientiousness. And I think if your question was, how do you lead in this space? You approach it in that manner rather than just for the pure optics of that. And by the way, ESG, sustainability, is another great example there. In our industry, in the airline, we burn 100 billion gallons of burnt of fossil fuel, right? I mean, if anybody should be interested in this space, right? It's something that needs to be managed. And so, but rather than going out and talking about it in a way that you need to be green and we need to conserve the planet, all important points, but I began to approach it really from a different perspective, from an economic perspective around the world. It's like, fuel price is incredibly volatile, and that volatility affects everyone's stock price because no one likes volatility. Fuel goes up, stocks go down, fuel goes down, stocks go up, and that's why everybody lives in this industry. I said, imagine a world where we had a fuel source, a consistent fuel source that, oh, by the way, just happens to be sustainable, that you wouldn't have to worry about the volatility. What would that do to your equity, to your stock? And when you do that math, you're like, oh my gosh, all these airline companies would fare so much better in their stock price if indeed they had that. But see how that's a different approach than green and the right thing to do for the planet, again, which is important, but it became an economic angle and said, oh, that I can sell to people. And again, we live in a world where you have to convince and sell in many different ways and topics, and agility and flexibility to have these conversations where people learn to listen and approach these things in a different way. And again, the proof not promised there is like the airline industry has embraced this concept of sustainable aviation fuel. And there's this big demand, hey, I want more of it, which fosters and fuels R&D, which fosters and fuels literally, pun intended, the potential for sustainable aviation fuel being something that's in our future at a manageable price. And that's how progress gets made in my example. And that all falls under DEI and ESG, but without the politicized nature that unfortunately we've made it in this country.
One of the things you just said, Oscar, was that, in this environment, you must have agility to talk about and look at things from all different angles. And indeed, I can't help but reflect on the past, not quite an hour or so that we've been talking. Our conversation has contained multitudes. I mean, you are coming at this from so many different lenses and angles. It's fascinating, truly. And I heard you drop in the middle of your last answer. I think you said something like, my first board seat I took when I was 41 years old. And by my math, I think you're probably only getting started now. You're probably not even midway through your career. So there's a lot more Oscar Munoz to observe and to look at in terms of your leadership in your career. I would just wrap up our discussion by asking, what legacy do you hope to leave as a leader?
And I learned this when I came to the railroad world, as I again spent a lot of time with frontline union employees that had been in the industry for 40, 50, even 60 years, and their mantra is something I really espouse, and I've added something to it. But their mantra was, "You always leave a place better than you found it." And I just thought that really resonated with me because that wasn't about me. It wasn't about anything. It was about, it was just, the people. And then importantly, who are the people that you leave behind? So the people that I brought along behind me, and I look at the amazing things that are being done at United, at CSX. I see my legacy in action with this concept of trust and transparency, proof not promise, listen, learn, and lead, all these little axioms that are out there. And the people I've recruited, mentored, provided opportunities, who are now leading in their own fashion, but with those thoughts, that human and heart associated sort of leadership stuff, I think it feels really good. And I hope to continue to provide that for anyone that will listen, because that has certainly been a successful approach for me.
Leaving a place better than you find it. What do you think your grandma would say about that?
Oh my God. She was just such a simple person. And she wouldn't know what to make of it because that was her nature. I mean, of course you would do that. Why are you actually saying that out loud? I mean, it's like, of course, right? And so I think that's what she would say. A quick funny story was, I remember when I was talking to her one day a long time ago, and I had just become the CFO, finance, of the whole Southeast region of Coca-Cola. So big job. I was very young still. And, she comes from a background where the concept of work was actually work, right? She thought of Coca-Cola. So you're making it, you're delivering it, right? That's work to her. So when I tried to explain what the CFO does, you could see the look in her eyes like, oh, mijo, which means kind of a gentle, my son. Like my son must not be so bright that they don't actually trust him enough to make or deliver this stuff. They have him in some room doing paperwork. So she was always wonderful to put perspective on all the things that we hold dear in our world of this thing. She was just very human in that regard. So leaving a place better than behind, that was just fundamental to her. And maybe, again, that's another one of those latent dormant values that I will hopefully leave for others.
Beautiful. Well, thanks for leaving us better than when you found us an hour ago. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Oscar.
All right. Take care.
You too.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.